This is Canon Fodder, episode 59, live from Oakland, California, with my good friend Mr. Grant Brooks of the Old Glory Club. How are you, sir?
Doing well, doing well. How about you, TR?
Oh, doing well. We were doing, our brief little intros before recording, and life's grand over here. Can't complain, and glad to hear things are good on your end. We actually had this set up for quite a while, and I just never got to Martin Eden, to my shame. Uh, it's a terrific book, and I'm so glad that you recommended it to me.
It's one of my favorites. I've always been a fan of Jack London since I read him as a child for school, but actually my wife read this book before I did and really recommended it to me as like, "Oh, I think you'll really really enjoy this." And I wasn't sure what really to make of that, but read it and it is, in my mind, probably Jack London's greatest work. It's certainly the one that I've enjoyed the most and that I've felt the most kinship with an author about.
Which is so weird because he wrote it as a cautionary tale. He wrote it ironically because he himself was, a socialist.
Yeah, and you can kind of tell in the book that he's doing the opposite thing where you put your intellectual opponents, you're writing from their perspective. You see it a
Right. He's
little
he's
bit with
steel manning the
Dostoevsky. Right.
yeah, he's steel manning the chud basically, and he makes it look really attractive.
Yeah, there's a particular passage. So the plot of the book revolves around this guy, Martin Eden, who is a sailor and very much a chud himself, who's essentially doing the Nietzschean will to power thing, sort of. And he gets pretty explicit with this stuff. Like, there's a whole passage in the book where he's arguing with this California Republican judge, Martin Eden is, and makes the statement that, like, you Republicans actually do believe in equality. I am a Nietzschean. I am a disciple of Herbert Spencer. I understand that equality is false. And it's just very, very striking. I'm kind of butchering it a little bit.
No, and we
Go
can.
ahead.
I mean, anybody who wants to get the full breadth and depth of uh, the prose of Jack London's prose, you gotta read it for yourself. Myself and Mr. Brooks, we're gonna do our butchering here, but it's well worth a read. Actually, do you know Blood and Rain, Arthur Dane?
I do. I
I
I,
I
I wanted to
DM'd
go on
him.
his cast a couple times, but I haven't yet.
I DM'd him today as I was thinking about this book because he's also from that area of California, and I was like, Arthur, like, I don't know if you've read Martin Eden, but he's you, and he did. I don't know how he'll take that. Hopefully, as a compliment by the time he reads it. But he said he's going to add it to his to read list. So uh,
I'm sure he'll enjoy it. The thing about it, I think it depends on to what degree he's willing to say like, he's literally me. Because when you read the beginning of this book, it it has a very different feel than when you get to the end. It's a
mhm.
semi autobiographical book in the sense that it's kind of Jack London talking about his own experiences and kind of very much not. But you can tell near the end where Martin Eden is kind of being consumed by a sort of cynicism that
Mhm.
in the beginning is just totally absent. There's this almost pulp adventure feel to it. And I think that's something
Right.
that's a
Yes.
hallmark of Jack London himself. Jack London is not regarded with the same sort of literary accolades of some other authors. And I think that's because people correctly surmise that he is borderline pulpish in
Mhm.
his love of action and adventure and sort of martial virtues. It's a very American thing, the way that he writes. But by the same token, that also comes across not exactly childish, but definitely a sort of adolescent character. And what's most interesting to me about this book is how you can really see a kind of transition, not only in Jack London, but in Martin Eden himself, from this sort of boundless, virile energy, this pulp adventure feel, to a much more refined, but also somewhat cynical view of the world.
Oh, definitely. I mean, he succumbs. He loses everything because he's so cynical, because he just doesn't see it as worth his time. He gets to the point that he believes that the world doesn't deserve him,
Yeah, it's a
and
very
such a man as
artistic,
he.
very artistic way of looking at things, right? That like he's transcended the need for any of you people, right? And it's interesting too, because in the early part of the book, as Martin Eden is beginning to write and finding how much he loves writing, he talks about some of his reasons for writing, and his reasons for writing being like, oh, I really wanted to just, I wanted to express to other people, like give them this sort of this joy, this feeling that I have, that is a much more, I mean, you can make arguments, but a more selfless view of why you're doing the art, versus near the end where it is so much more a pure, like, I'm doing this because I do this and I don't care what you think.
And I mean, he's also doing it at the beginning, for a woman, right? He is
Yes.
infatuated with Ruth Morse, with upper class society in general, and he does have an almost childlike view of social class, which, I mean, you can kind of have that in America, right? It's less so. Uh, you can't, like, the classes are more codified in Europe, right?
Yeah, it's
So
definitely a
you
very
can.
American feel. And even the West Coast versus the East
Mhm.
Coast. I mean, all the like parties that he goes to, right, where he's beginning to hobnob with high society, as it were. High society in America looks very, very different. You're not getting any of these scenes like the royal court in England, right? You have these people who are very learned and fascinating figures, professors and that sort of thing. But that part of the self-discovery is Martin Eden realizing that, really these people aren't that different from me, which is kind of a socialistic message, but also kind of a very American message,
Mhm.
that
But
there's not really a difference between these people.
right, and in fact, I think he's disappointed by the fact that they're not so different from him, and he comes to view them with disdain, because actually he surpasses them, because they're decadent, because they're lazy. He's the kind of man. If you would have put him exactly where he was 20 years prior, because this is like, turn of the century United States, California, not long before, this is still the Wild West. In some ways, it still kind of is. The West has closed, but hasn't closed completely. Martin Eden would have been would have been able to found a dynasty. He would have been one of
Without
these
a doubt.
rough men, who would have founded California properly. But he's like maybe one generation removed, maybe two, right? Uh, and he's this. Oh, what can you say? He's too late to the party in some ways, and he kind of resents the fact that it only took two generations for these guys to become weak and decadent.
Yeah, he's a sort of, I've used this phrase myself, but I think it applies to Martin Eden far more than it applies to me. He's a late son of the frontier. And the
Mm,
thing you can say about him that is interesting in sort of a survey of American history, a lot of the settlement of the northern frontier of the United States, if we look at it now, it's very populated historically by these Germans or Scandinavians, other immigrant groups, right? But almost all these towns, these major areas, are all founded by your old stock Anglos or Scots Irish. But what they would do is they would they would found a town, they'd put all the work in, and then they just sort of move on and go do it again and go do it again.
Right.
It was putting in all the work, but actually not reaping the benefits, as it were. And it's easy to see Martin Eden as being of that stock, even though his travels are not over land, there on the sea. That too is a very American thing. The Yankees of Massachusetts did a lot of colonialism themselves on these various islands, where it was just like their kids showing up and being like, well, I guess we're going to build a Puritan Commonwealth, a little mini one here in Hawaii or here somewhere else.
Right. And it's funny too because, Hawaii for a long time was the place that God cannot see. It was you can kind of do what you want. And I think it was not Oahu. I think it was Maui that had the devastating fires and the historic downtown that had been founded by sailors, or at least had been built up by them, burned to the ground, unfortunately, in those fires.
Yeah. We
I
see a
wanted
lot of,
to.
actually. Sorry,
Oh,
go on.
yeah, oh yeah, many such cases recently, of course. Uh, thoughts and prayers to the people of California these days.
Yeah, and it's sort of a long-standing thing. Like, I think the West is maybe unique in this sense of how much of the history just kind of gets wiped out. I think that's another aspect of, Martin Eden is a story not only specific to America, but specific to the West Coast or the Western frontier of America. And it doesn't really make sense in any other context.
When Martin is going to the parties and he's being even at the very beginning, right? He's brought as this sort of savage wild man by Arthur Morse, who is a real scumbag if I'm gonna be honest. Uh, and he's brought this guy to the Morse household as a sort of as a treat. He figures that
Yeah,
Martin
as
will
a
get a
monkey, basically.
yeah Martin will get a good meal out of this, and will be entertained by his provincial ways, not knowing, of course, that Martin is a man of will and destiny. That he sees for a second, he sees what life can be, so he has to go and take it. And he reminds me a lot of John the Savage, later on in Brave New World, right? That very much the simple son of the soil type person,
Yeah, exactly.
far away from the decadent future uh, that he gets kind of thrust into for no reason other than because it's entertaining for everybody to meet him, and oh, look how simple he is, uh look how different he is from us, right? Kind of like, I guess you could say King Kong as well. That taking the man out of the jungle and putting him in civilization and then fawning over him.
Well, it's a motif that dates all the way back to the Romans, doesn't it? Parading these learned Gauls and Germans throughout the streets of Rome, right? Look at these naked, savage barbarians, but these very clever barbarians. They could teach you a thing or two. Look at the purity that they exemplify that you have lost. But at the same time, it's almost a minstrel act, right? Of like, you are parading them around as a sort of like, I don't know. I really think your point about Arthur Morse is correct. Like, you have to, the book skirts right over it, but when you think about it, you're like, what was his motives for
Well,
this?
and
What
he even
were, like,
says it. It's kind of
go ahead.
explicit. I think it's chapter 1 or 2 that Arthur Morse, like, he got into some trouble, and uh, Martin got him out of it. So as a reward, he brought him to his home as like, look at the wild man, right? And he disappoints because Martin himself is very self-conscious. So he doesn't say a lot, and he tries to act learned when, especially when talking to Ruth.
Yeah, you see, in a certain sense, right, a biblical wisdom there of like understanding you're out of your depth, so you say so little. And that's one of the other things that the book does a great job of sort of developing, because as Martin Eden is at the beginning of his journey, he is so unwilling to sort of, I don't know how to put it. Like, speak is not really communicating what I mean, but like express himself. He's very, very reserved. And as the book goes on, as he gains sort of the accoutrements of civilization, he grows more and more willing to express himself. But in some ways, that winds up making him more and more hostile to that civilization. I think that's something that Jack London does such a good job in this book that I haven't observed in his other works.
There's one specific part that tickles me when he kind of interacts with Frank Ronsley, the hack,
Yeah.
the other writer, the guy who's like, just doing it for the money. And I think, especially I try to write fiction. I try to, sell books and magazines and such. Buy my books and magazines, folks. You can find them at the doubledealer.substack.com. But it's always, especially when I shill, I feel like dirty and like a prostitute. And I think everybody, especially in this sphere, sees themselves as a Martin Eden and sees mainstream publishing as like a Frank Ronsley.
Well, and they're right to do so, right? I mean, like, there's even more in our day and age that makes that obvious. Mainstream publishers being like, well, we want stories of color. We want
Femme Gooner literature.
right. We've got to have our bookstore that's like half like thinly veiled pornography.
I don't
Uh,
know. Thinly veiled makes it seem like they're attempting to hide something.
well, okay, you got me. I had spent a long time since I've been in a bookstore that sells new books, but even when I did go there, that was one of the things that kind of struck me, and where maybe one of the things that makes me sympathetic or see a little bit of myself in Martin Eden was, I loved books growing up, and I
Hmm.
always wanted to be able to read whatever I could get my hands on. But as I grew a little bit older, I started to get very frustrated with bookstores because, I'd always go to Barnes and Noble or whatever. But I would begin to observe that so many of the books in this bookstore were just, to put it simply, garbage. I was like, why do people buy this? And why is this in this store? Like, you have the chance to read whatever you want, and there's this almost like this bottomless well of knowledge of great works. And just that's people don't care. People just want to read like the part 12 of the vampire rich, like I don't know where I'm even going with this, but like,
Right. Right. I'll kind of I'll butt in and help you out with a little anecdote. My wife read one of those Sarah J. Maas books, which is like I don't know, it's some sort of vampire or fairy thing with big wings, and she read aloud to me a sex scene that was going on, and this is supposed to get like women all hot and bothered, and luckily my wife doesn't read this crap anymore, which is good. But I was just thinking the whole time as she was reading aloud, like, well, this thing's supposed to have wings. How is that going to work? Just in physically, where does its wings go when it does this, that, and the other? And I don't think they're putting in too much effort into figuring that out. either.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, to bring it back to Martin Eden and the hack author, right? It's just like, rinse and repeat, right? Just get a formula, you change a few of the details, and then you just redo the formula.
Right. And I mean, that's like, at this time, Pulp is coming out. So I'm wondering if this is Jack London, uh, talking about Pulp Fiction
Oh, no,
generally.
absolutely. This is absolutely, you can see a lot of Jack London's personal issues with pulp literature, like the dime. I don't know that the dime novel was still a thing at that point, but something like that. There's a sort of balance he walks there with, like, Martin Eden loves writing these stories that are very forceful and very pulpy in that sense, right? But then on the other hand, you can tell Jack London has a sort of distaste for these publications and for the very formulaic nature of so many of the stories. Like, it's just the same thing over and over again. And I think that's maybe a commentary on the type of person that he is, being a sort of almost a proto frog in his contrarianism, right? Because even though Jack London himself is a socialist, near the end of his life, the things he has to say about socialism are not that dissimilar from something you would read on right-wing Twitter.
Yeah, which, and that might be a critique of right-wing Twitter these days. You can kind of post whatever you want as long as you post a vitalist sort of guy doing something with it. You know what I mean? Like, if he's lifting weights, he can say whatever he wants, and it'll blow up on Twitter.
Well, and that's maybe the point you could make of the pulpy nature of the Americans, right? You know, give us a cool action adventure hero who's awesome and kills people, and we don't really care what he says or what he does. I sort of think about this in relation to something like the Dollars trilogy.
Mm,
uh I am a huge fan of classic westerns. I think
right, right.
people who know
Or
me,
especially High Noon, right? That's like the overtly socialist one.
yeah, I am that one. Definitely, they had to be a little bit more subtle about it. Something like The Searchers is more what I would consider a classic Western story. But you compare something like High Noon or The Searchers versus the Dollars trilogy, and you can see that the element that people really enjoy watching is the guy who shows up and guns down bad guys. And whether
Right.
he himself is a bad guy really doesn't matter that much. What his motives are really don't matter that much. What his backstory is, and even in a sense, really doesn't matter that much. We the Americans, we want to see the bad guys run into someone that they didn't expect who guns them down in the street.
Right. And America doesn't have ideology, it has locomotion, right? As long as you're moving forward. People love Teddy Roosevelt, right?
Right.
But some of his policy, I mean, he was like the progressive, right? He at least kicked off the progressive era, or was maybe the poster child for it. And you think, well, progress is a dirty word these days, and it ended the Gilded Era or the Gilded Age, right? It's like
Yes.
but he was such a force of dynamism that no one could. You can't hate Teddy Roosevelt, like
No,
as
you
much.
can't. I mean, there's just there's that vitalistic element, right? Because I mean, even Teddy Roosevelt, you can go back and do, and I'll say that I myself have done this and will do this at certain points. You can go back and do the based progressive movement. The receipts for that do exist. Teddy Roosevelt talking about how Anglo-Saxon democracy is superior because it preserves a eugenic form of the white race. But by the same token, a guy like Teddy Roosevelt, right? He had this vitalism causes him to be led by the nose, right? He's foaming at the mouth to bring America into World War One, which was
Hmm.
probably destructive war for our civilization in recorded history.
Right. The modern Teddy Roosevelt is the hick lib, at least in its excesses.
Yeah, the guy who's telling you like, "Oh, you believe in a Bronze Age mindset. Well, why aren't you going to Ukraine? You know, why aren't you doing this? We need to be doing more
We
to
just need to be
attack
doing.
Russia." Well,
Like
it's
you,
almost like you could do the almost the Patrick Bateman line, right? About like, oh, well, we need to end apartheid in South Africa. We need to, do this, that, and the other thing. And you can tell that it's all not necessarily. I mean, it is in a sense cynical, but more in the sense of like the details literally do not matter to these people. It's just all about the form. We're gonna do the thing, and our reasons for the thing and our motives for the thing, not so important as doing the thing.
contrast the hack writer with uh, I guess the man that is closest to Martin Eden, Mr. Bressenden or Bressenden,
Brissenden is the way the audiobook pronounces it, so I'm
Brissenden.
going with
Yes,
that one.
yes. So he's like he's the exact opposite, right? He's the starving artist, radical type, truth teller, sort of says it like it is kind of guy who he and Martin strike up a friendship because they both see how phony things kind of are in the upper crust. And actually, Brissenden says, "Hey, this is going to kill you. You should just stop and go back to what you were doing before. It's a more authentic life."
Yeah, which that in and of itself, right, is that's a very sort of artistic thing to say. Yeah, I know you're really into this whole writing and will to power and all that stuff. You should go back to being like an itinerant sailor. You'll be happier. And it's like, well, that may be true, but you know, it's it's very entertaining to read the exchanges between Brissenden and Martin Eden. Especially, I would say, for people in our scene when Brissenden introduces Martin Eden to the like, I guess we'll call him like the socialist reading club or whatever.
Hmm. Right.
You will feel a certain kinship there if you were initiated into like right wing Twitter or Telegram group chats or any of this stuff.
Right.
It
It's like,
feels
I've always thought of this thing just because, of where I grew up and who I grew up around. I've always thought of this thing of ours, and even that is borrowing a term from the mafia, right? It's like, you get, if you once you get initiated into a group chat, that's kind of like getting made. People, a guy adds you to a group chat, he's standing up for you, telling everybody he's a good fella, kind of thing. Uh, and that's just how men are. You get indoctrinated in a certain way, but indoctrinated isn't the right word. I guess just
well,
brought into a thing.
it is this very like Cold War, maybe anachronistic way of like, the good person has just been corrupted and they can't go back to being heckin' normal. But if you've been around our scene, you kind of get that there's some of that, yes, but the flip side of that is you have come to understand that you're being lied to. And you kind of have a moment of decision of like, well, do I swallow the lies or do I try and forge ahead in the truth? And if you select the latter option, these groups are almost a life sentence to you. You find these other people who have also committed themselves that no, I will not accept the lies. And I'm going to try and figure out whether it's, the world or ideals or what we're supposed to do or any of this stuff. How should we then live? They're trying to figure that out in light of the fact that they reject what they know to be false. I think that's the comparison. can't be taken too far. These people are socialists who are kind of in a particular scene that's trying to bring down civilization, but there's definitely a sort of kinship there. There's definitely a sort of kinship there of all these guys who are talking about, I've read Marx, I understand that things aren't exactly the way they're being presented, versus one of us, being able to say,
It's like,
I
oh,
understand.
I read Steve Salier.
Yeah, I've read Steve Saylor. I've read Ron Unz. I've read Curtis Yarvin or whatever. You're different than someone who hasn't, and that's just a reality.
And it's funny, you could extrapolate uh, that analogy out a little bit further, right? Because you have three paths. Uh, you can be the hack writer who sees the world for what it is and decides to make money off of it, right? The grifter account, the guy who rebrands himself 50 times and sells a course on how to, what's that Andrew Tate Hustlers University?
Yeah, yeah,
Right, right. So you could do that and probably make a few bucks, and anybody who sees you for what you are hates your guts, right? Or you can be, the truth teller, the true believer, who stays in it long enough where you get cynical, but you also hold on to the dream for a long time. Or you could be Martin Eden and get cynical and kill yourself, which I
yeah,
don't recommend.
yeah.
Uh,
That's maybe the part that we're gonna have to deal with as well. The ultimate conclusion of Martin Eden, I think, is Jack London's. He attempts to steelman individualism, but I think this is the inescapable sense that he views individualism's ultimate conclusion as suicide.
Now,
That's why Martin Eden kills himself.
okay, now that's no, I thought about this a lot because I have been thinking about man as individual versus man as part of, a species, a collective, a group, a people, a nation, whatever, right? Alienation, right? Individualism is just the flip side of alienation, right? You're an individual by choice, or you're an individual because nobody wants to be around you.
Yes, or
Death is the end of the individual.
right. Yeah, a finality to it.
If say you're part of a church, I'm Orthodox, so my church has been around, since the apostles, right? uh 2,000 years of unbroken tradition, hopefully, 2,000 more after I'm gone. And you know that's something, right? That's something I can attach myself to, that my children can attach themselves to, their children, etc. Or to be less sectarian about it, we could say your last name, right? That you are an
Right.
unbroken
You're
you
the
are an
children.
unbroken family tree. You are the latest iteration of a long line of people who had to do a lot to get to where you are. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And it's
For
your
me,
responsibility to sojourn that forward in the next generation.
right. For me, there's a sort of a very strong sense in this. I myself am a Protestant, but my family has been Protestant basically from the inception of the Protestant Reformation. To find a Catholic in my family tree, you have to go back to the 16th century. And
Your
so,
your ancestor was the first one to read the 95 Theses and was like, "Yeah, this guy's talking some truth here. I'm
some,
gonna follow him, Mister Luther."
well, and lineage acts this way too, as you point out, not just the direct lineage, but the indirect lineage of the nation, right? My ancestry in America dates back to the very earliest days of colonial settlement. And so I can look on the history of America as this sort of chain that anchors me to the past. And as I have children, anchors me to the future. That my ancestors were the people who founded this republic, and my children are its inheritors.
Right. Was it Filmer, The Great Chain of Being, or
That sounds right. I haven't read Filner, so I'm not totally sure, but That does sound.
I've watched a lot of. I used to watch AA's content a lot, and I know that was something that he picked up. And I know he read Filner, so I'm guessing that that's where he got it. But could be from something else.
Spiritually, if not literally.
Right, right. Yes, definitely of the same mind.
But I do think that this point is worth making, that whether we agree with Jack London, I think Jack London's point is that for all the beauty of individualism, all the will to power, all the Nietzschean or Spencerian uh, glory and romance of it, at the end of the day, it's just you. And it is a sort of suicide because we're mortal. We have a limited time on this earth. You have a limited time to spend what you're given. And sometimes, even if you don't really intend to spend it, it gets spent. I mean, you see that theme woven a little bit through the story in the later portions of it.
I mean, even you could say that jumping your class is a suicidal act, right? Because you are alienating yourself from your friends, and the people who you are trying to ingratiate yourself with will never see you as an equal unless you the best you can hope for is that the next generation will kind of treat your children better than their parents treated that you kind of deal, right? And you see there's a sort of tragic ending when Martin gives Joe, his buddy Joe, the laundromat, or the
Yeah.
laundry, right?
Hmm.
And Joe's like, I don't want this, man. I enjoy being what I am. I kind of want to be a hobo. I don't want the responsibility or the to be tied down by society. And Martin kind of is like, no, 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 you want this, and you can do whatever you want with it. But you can read that as a sort of corruption at the end. It's like it's
Well,
this.
absolutely is, right? I mean, it's a sort of gross return to materialism. It actually doesn't matter what you want your life to be. Here's some means. Go become a manager. Join Burnham's revolution, right?
And Martin meanwhile, I think you can. It is the fatal flaw of the Nietzschean Superman archetype to not leave behind to found this great thing only to have it break apart after his generation. Uh, you could see not Hamlet, Macbeth. You can see Macbeth definitely as this sort of man of will, although he's a little bit more conflicted about his actions than say you know in Nietzsche and Superman would be. But it dies out in after his generation, right? You could say the same of Alexander the Great. That's probably a more apt analogy, where he builds the largest empire ever assembled, only for it to just completely break apart right after his death. It's
You could say the same of Oliver Cromwell, right? Who's this incredible figure in British military history.
I'm Irish, so
Well, you'll have to suffer through this analogy then. Undefeated on the fields of the British Isles, he's able to form a sort of proto-fascist Commonwealth Republic. But when he passes, it's barely 2 years and the thing falls apart because ultimately it was him and it was just him. There wasn't a foundation that could last. There wasn't this thing that was far enough outside of you that it could outlive you in a real sense.
I said it flippantly when I said that I was Irish, but the fact that I still, I'm Irish, so I hate Cromwell. Like that's so ingrained in who I am because of where I come from.
Right, exactly. And I think there's a sort of health to that, right? One of the things that you could say is a negative about the American experience is that it does tend to try and level all of that stuff out. And it's
Right.
understandable why, it is in a sense very unhelpful for capital to return or hold on to any of these old world grudges, right? And there is this very strong impulse to just let it go. But in a certain sense, those scars, they make us who we are. And
Right.
to lose them is to lose something of yourself. I think about this in sort of I'll get in arguments with people every once in a while about the conquering of the American frontier, because you'll get the people who are like, it was just like pure trail of tears. And it's like, no, this was war. My ancestors fought a brave enemy, and many of them died to win this country for me. And I don't want to forget that just because right now, like being worried about, the various native tribes seems ridiculous. Like,
We
no, those were a historic enemy that helped make me who I am.
we definitely talked about this when we discussed Heart of Darkness, which is the last time that you were on the podcast. And if you're listening to this now, go back and listen to that. It was a great conversation. It's funny how you and I always get back to colonialism and conquest, but I definitely brought up Empire of the Summer Moon, and the winning of the West and the defeat of the Comanche Indians, right? And you're completely right. The Comanche were a proud warrior people who lost a war, right? They might have had fewer numbers, but they were a savage people. And I don't mean savage as in less than or whatever, but I just mean in their tactics. They were
Right.
merciless.
Not lose the war for lack of trying.
Exactly. It's not the crying Indian on the side of the highway because you littered, right? These guys were out for blood. They stole away women and children and used them. You brought up the Searchers before, which is very similar. It's based on a very famous story of a Comanche raid on a Texas outpost or Texas home, right? And trying to get this little girl, I think it's Dorothy Parker, back
Right.
from the Comanche. She ends up having a son, Quanah Parker, who is like the last war chief of the Comanche, right? Read Empire of the Summer Moon. It's a terrific book. Anyway, I only bring up the Searchers again because I also Last Things, who's a friend of ours, has a film festival. He put out a new one this year. Last year I did The Searchers with him. Great conversation. Highly recommend you go follow his work. Trying to do a Trumpian weave here where I shill my friend's stuff.
Dude, I'll have to check that out. That sounds great.
Yeah,
Just
no,
not
I think
my favorite
yeah,
Western.
last year I went for like over 2 hours. I think the only person who went longer than me that time was George Bagby.
I
Uh,
believe it.
yeah, and he really smart guy. You know him. But yeah, I'll send you a link to that because you should definitely check it out. Last Things deserves
That sounds
everybody's eyeballs.
great. I've meant to go on that myself to do the filmic version of Heart of Darkness, Apocalypse Now. But you even mentioned the colonial things, or the bringing up colonialism with me. This kind of touches on that point exactly. The reason why I talk about colonialism so much is I am in a real sense a creation of that sort of that world. It's exactly what I am. I am a creature of settling the frontier. And I think the thing that is sort of throughout both Martin Eden and the works of Conrad is wrestling with to what degree this legacy is A, present, but B, accepted by its inheritors. I think
Mm,
about Martin Eden, the person, is he really doesn't he doesn't have a strong conception of himself outside of this artistic endeavor at all. I mean, you can kind of say chalk that up to the individualism stuff. You know, he performed all these great adventures. He lived the dare we say the Bappian life of adventure, right? But it was all sort
Only
of
to become a word cell.
yeah, it was all for nothing. And he really, when he was exposed to this world of like literary you know, not only the sort of high society right on the front end, but then on the back end, this sort of like literary society of the socialist reading club, right? All that stuff to him is like, who cares? And even his family, which I think that's another thing that we should get to next, the way that Jack London writes about Martin Eden's family. But even the way that he I would say interacts with them or understands his relation to them feels very transactional in a sense.
Mm. Well, and that's part of his alienation is like, he succumbs to materialism. So of course, all human interaction is going to feel transactional to him.
But it's funny because like the critique, or I guess you could say the thing he really dislikes in the beginning about his brother-in-law is essentially that he regards him as a mere materialist. You know, he does the like the guy's a shopkeeper, right? And he does the like shopkeeper morality type of thing. You just care about like the grocery clerks collecting the receipt, right? But in a sense, it's a sort of mirror that winds up being the exact way that Martin Eden deals with his family.
No, definitely. There's another character I wanted to go over. Name is escaping me right now. Uh, oh, actually, all right, we'll go over this. So Martin Eden, right? His name is a direct play on the Garden of Eden, the fall of man, the sort of uh, the eating of the tree of knowledge that ends up dooming mankind. Is Jack London saying that ignorance is bliss here?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I not to sidetrack from what you just brought up, which is important, but I just found a quote from Jack London specifically about what we were talking about earlier. Apparently, one of the pastors of the Congregational Church in Oakland gave a sermon where he essentially suggested that the book Martin Eden demonstrated that Jack London didn't believe in God. And Jack
Mm.
London wrote him a letter where he says, I wrote Martin Eden not as an autobiography, nor as a parable of what dire end awaits an unbeliever in God, but as indictment of the pleasant, wild beast struggle of individualism. He fought for an entrance into the bourgeoisie circles where he expected to find refinement, culture, high living, and high thinking. He won his way into those circles and was appalled by the colossal, unloving mediocrity of the bourgeoisie. Being a consistent individualist, being unaware of the collective human need, there remained nothing for which to live and fight, and so he died.
One has to sit with that for a moment. You can't say that Jack London was flippant, right? He believed this and he thought very deeply about this. I don't know. When I first read it, I thought, oh, he commits suicide. That's kind of a cop out. That's like a way for Jack London to say, see, this idea was actually bad all along. But as we discussed it, I've kind of talked myself into, well, I mean, there's really nowhere else for an individualist to go, especially like, this will evolve. Obviously he lived before Ayn Rand, but Ayn Rand and objectivism really is like turbo Martin Eden, right? And that only has one place left to go.
Well, okay, let's take it a different way. You know who's even more turbo Martin Eden is Robert E. Howard. And I am a huge fan of the stories of Robert E. Howard. I love Solomon Kane. I love Conan. They're great great pulp adventures. But Robert E. Howard met the same fate that
Yes, he
Martin.
did. Well, and that's the thing too. At least you can say that at least Martin Eden's work may live on. Robert E. Howard certainly did. Jack London's certainly has. And in some sense, the Randian objectivists, the ones that go on to found businesses and stuff, most of those are still kind of around. Though, to be honest, I don't know any off the top of my head. Uh, I think objectivism is one of those things that you kind of pick up in high school, and then you go on to other things.
Well, I'll say this as well. I think objectivism and Ayn Rand are a significant downgrade from the works of Nietzsche and Herbert Spencer. Even if we accept that the logical conclusion of those works is suicide, I think it's fair to say that Jack London had enormous respect for those thinkers and for their worldview. And I think it's also fair to say that they're significantly more compelling than their later antecedents.
Mm.
Although that's just a personal take. I would say, having read a few of these thinkers, like it may just be an opinion thing. I personally find Herbert Spencer and Nietzsche more compelling than Ayn Rand.
Right.
Even though,
Well, I mean, that's obvious. Ayn Rand is, if brevity is the soul of wit, well, then you just pick up an Ayn Rand book and there you go.
yeah, pretty much.
The character of Lizzie. That's it. I wanted to bring her up as maybe not only symbolic of Martin's wandering eye, sort of, but also just his complete alienation from where he came from, as opposed to where he wanted to be. Right. Lizzie is a worker at a cannery, and the most impactful thing that Martin can comment about her, I guess. I'll try to make that grammatically sound in my head, but anyway, is that she has these rough worker's hands, right? She's a working class girl. She's had a job most of her life, and because of that, and working with machinery, she is tainted in his eyes because she's not soft, and she's not soft like Ruth. She's not pretty like Ruth. She's not unblemished like Ruth is. But in any other, if Martin hadn't gone down this path, he would have been happy with Lizzie, and they would have had a whole brood of children, and onward the Eden line would go.
Right, exactly. There's a sort of real sense in which you can say that is the cost of the refinement, right? Is that Martin Eden can never look at a girl like Lizzie the way that he would have had he never stepped into this world.
There's another man. I mentioned my friend Arthur Dane, who's a friend of yours as well, uh, and how I saw him in this book. There's another man, a little bit more well known, that I think pretty well encapsulates Martin Eden, and that's future almost Vice President of the United States, JD Vance.
So true.
He is he is like this, and I've got my problems with JD Vance, but objectively, from the outside looking in, the man is a force. Coming from where he came from, probably the poorest part of the nation, to work his way to the Ivy League, through the U.S. military, founding a tech company, rubbing shoulders with the most powerful sort of Silicon Valley guys, winning a Senate seat, and then becoming vice president of the United States. Probably will be president of the United States, and the first millennial to do so. I, you know,
The last,
policy aside, how can you not admire that?
yeah, exactly. He's in that sense kind of the last son of the wasps, right? Obviously, he doesn't look at all like those people, but the creation of the wasps as a sort of as a class, as something that we would understand, was via the means of the Episcopal Church, the U.S. military, and the Ivy Leagues. And Vance, you got 2 out of those 3, and you can
And
tell.
look what he had to sacrifice because he's a
Yeah.
Catholic now. I mean, I say that kind of as a joke, but seriously, like, and the man uh, forewent his forefathers' religion.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, some could say, and I'll piss off the Protestants with this, but it's like, oh yeah, he's just fixing an aberration, and I say that tongue in cheek. I don't actually mean it. I don't want to get into a sectarian flame war, because I'm not equipped for it. But yeah, he abandoned the church of his forefathers, going to the Catholic Church, which I guess was the church of his forefathers, right?
Well, if you want to, use that line, I won't rise to the sectarianism either, but I think it is true that he sacrificed an enormous amount to get where he is. To get it. And the point too about him is like even his politics. JD Vance was once what people would uncharitably call a libtard striver or a
Mhm.
Hitler. And he's over reliably on our side now. He's on Twitter talking about, like, don't worry, we're going to make sure that the J6ers get a fair shake. But you do have to wonder with someone like that, what are you going to be left with at the end of your life? What do you have? What do you have to gain that's going to be better than giving up everything you are?
Well, and I guess that's what I was. This is very generous of me to compare him to uh, Alexander the Great, right? Who kind of sheds his Greekness in order to become like a Persian god, right? And he has a bunch of children. Doesn't he have like one son who is killed in his cradle after uh,
That sounds right.
yeah, after Alexander dies, so that there's no direct heir to the throne, right? JD Vance has shed a lot, but might be founding sort of a new line for himself, uh, through that crucible that he's going through, or that he's gone through rather. Remains to be seen. Maybe
Well,
maybe
that's
we'll
the
do
question.
another. Hmm?
That's the question. Is it a project of vanity, or is it Abraham being called out of Ur the Chaldeans to found a new nation? And you hope that you're on the right side of that, but it's a dangerous game. And I think for this story specifically, the message that Jack London is trying to convey is that it is a vanity. You're simply going to lose who you are.
And for what is I think also, Jack London's also saying that he ain't worth it, bro. If you're going to do something like this, it better be for something more than a girl.
Well, and particularly that type of a girl. Like I think you can kind of see a little bit of the subtext of Jack London thinking, you know, bourgeoisie, respectable West Coast Protestant lawyer family. Like there is a hard edge there of like the direct inverse enemy of the socialist, right?
Yeah, and as it's the same with John Steinbeck for me, where yeah, I hate socialists, I hate communists, but I like John Steinbeck and I like Jack London.
The thing at least you can say about Jack London that I don't know that I can say about Steinbeck. Maybe you can correct me on this, but Jack London feels to me much more like he truly admires, in a sense, these things that he opposes, right? The Nietzschean individualism or Spencerian individualism, whatever. There is an admiration there for that spirit and that strength. You can see that throughout all of his work. And even in the end of his life, where he starts to say, these socialists are really just like all this collectivism is really a sort of welfareism, like it's a spirit that crushes anything good and great. And you start to wonder, did his old enemies' arguments start working on him or something? But the thing about this story is you really can take what he writes here with whatever priors you're bringing in and still see a great story. That's, I think, the real triumph of the book, is whether you are an individualist or a collectivist or, like us, maybe something else, a secret third.
A secret third thing, yes. Yes.
You can see the greatness of the story.
I think I'll end it there. I had a whole spiel on the evangelical church that just doesn't feel relevant anymore in this part of the conversation, and even maybe a bit mean-spirited. So I think we'll end it there, Mr. Brooks. Why don't you tell the good people out there, unless there's anything else that you want to bring up?
No, I wouldn't say anything more beyond go read the book itself and go check out all those things that Mr. Hudson just plugged.
Yes, and there's a good audiobook version of Martin Eden that's on YouTube that I quite enjoyed. And there's a fun play on words at the beginning with the poet Swinson.
Yeah, Swinson, I think.
Yeah, and Martin Eden, before he's only read the name, so he calls him Swinson, and it's good. Definitely, you should go go take a look at his work, or at that work rather. Mr. Brooks, tell us where we can find you, how we can support you, and anything you got coming down the pipe.
Well, I can be found at the Old Glory Club's Substack. I will occasionally write articles either about Florida or just whatever else catches my fancy. And then I also run the history podcast associated with the Old Glory Club. I highly recommend you check that out, particularly the last few episodes. We have some good ones. On adjacent topics, I have one with Christopher Sandbach about California specifically that makes a nice little side dish to this conversation, I would say. So
I will certainly link that one, and you're gonna have to DM me that podcast because
will do.
I wasn't aware of it, and I love the Old Glory Club and what you guys are doing, and anybody who knows me knows that I'm a big Chris Sandbach fan. I try to have him on as often as I can. As for me, you know where to find me and everything that I'm doing. So I don't know how to end podcasts, so I will say insert ending here. Goodbye.